The slap cracked across the bar like a gunshot. Every conversation died. Every glass stopped midway to someone's lips. Staff Sergeant Ryan Mercer stood there grinning, hand still raised, waiting for the woman to cry, to beg to shrink into herself the way he expected. She didn't. Rachel Carter turned her head back slowly, and the look in her eyes made 3 combat veterans near the pool table take one instinctive step backward. Not anger. Something colder. Something that had kept men alive in places that didn't exist on any map. If you're watching this story for the first time, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Now stay with me, because what happened next changed every person in that bar forever. The Iron Anchor had been standing on the edge of Harbor Point for 31 years, and in all that time, the bartender, a retired Navy corpsman named Dennis Greer, had seen every kind of trouble walk through that door. He had seen bar fights that started over nothing and ended with someone losing teeth. He had seen men come back from deployments with something broken behind their eyes and try to drink it quiet. He had seen women get talked over, talked down, to touched without permission, and dismissed before they finished a sentence. He thought he had seen everything. He had not seen Rachel Carter. She came in just after 7 on a Friday, during the peak of the noise, during the hour when the young Marines from the base down the coast were loud enough to rattle the bottles on the shelf. She took the last stool at the far end of the bar, away from the cluster of uniforms, away from the televisions and the music and the raised voices. She set her jacket over the back of the stool. She folded her hands on the counter. "Water," she said when Dennis came over. "Just water for now." Dennis looked at her for a moment. She was somewhere in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with the kind of face that didn't broadcast its age, calm, watchful, arranged. Dark hair pulled back. No jewelry except a thin scar along the left side of her jaw that most people probably never noticed, because most people were not looking for it. He brought the water. She thanked him quietly. She didn't touch her phone. She didn't look around the room the way visitors usually did, cataloging faces and exits out of curiosity. She already knew where the exits were. Dennis had been around enough operators in his career to recognize that. The way she positioned herself with her back at a partial angle to the wall. The way her eyes moved over the room in a single practiced sweep, and then settled, not restlessly, scanning, but simply aware. The way she held absolutely still in a room full of people who couldn't stop moving. He didn't say anything. It wasn't his business. He refilled her water once and left her alone, which was exactly what she seemed to want. The problem was Staff Sergeant Ryan Mercer. Mercer had been coming to the Iron Anchor every Friday for the better part of 2 years, and in that time he had built himself a particular kind of kingdom. It was a small kingdom. One bar, one crowd of junior Marines who admired him. One stool near the television that he preferred over all others, but Mercer ruled it with complete conviction. He was 36 years old, built wide across the shoulders, with a rack of ribbons on his dress uniform that he referenced often even when he was in civilian clothes. He had been downrange twice. He carried those deployments the way some men carry money, visibly constantly as currency. His Marines loved him for it. To a 22-year-old Lance Corporal fresh out of boot camp, Mercer was the embodiment of everything the recruiter had promised. He was loud in the way that felt like confidence. He was aggressive in the way that felt like strength. He told stories about contact in Helmand and Fallujah that made younger men lean in and forget their drinks. And he needed an audience the way some men need oxygen. That was the thing Dennis had noticed over 2 years of watching Mercer work a room. The man was not comfortable unless people were paying attention. He filled silence with noise, not because he had something to say, but because silence made him anxious. He dominated conversations not because he was the most interesting person in them, but because being the center of something, anything, was the only way he knew how to feel real. Tonight, his audience was 8 Marines ranging from corporal to sergeant, plus 3 civilian women who had made the mistake of looking impressed early in the evening and were now trapped in the orbit of his attention. He was in the middle of a story about a vehicle-mounted patrol in Fallujah, animating it with his hands, pausing at the right moments for effect, watching his Marines' faces the way a conductor watches the orchestra. He was good at it. Dennis could admit that. The man had real combat experience, and he knew how to shape it into something that held a room. The problem was, he never stopped. He needed one story to lead into the next, one audience reaction to fuel the next performance. And somewhere in the middle of his third story of the night, with a bourbon in his right hand and the complete attention of 7 young Marines, his eyes drifted down the length of the bar and landed on the woman at the far end. She wasn't looking at him. That was the thing. In a bar where every person had at some point turned toward the noise of Mercer's performance, the woman at the end was the only one still facing straight forward, both hands around her glass completely and deliberately elsewhere. It should have meant nothing. It meant everything to a man like Mercer. "Hold on," he said mid-sentence, and his Marines followed his gaze. "Staff Sergeant, give me a minute." He set his bourbon down. He rolled his shoulders back the way he did before a confrontation, a habit so automatic he probably didn't know he did it. He walked the length of the bar and dropped into the empty stool, one seat to Rachel's right, leaning forward with his elbow on the counter and his body angled toward her. "You come here often," he said. Rachel didn't turn her head. "No." "First time." "Yes." "What brings you out?" She picked up her glass and took a slow sip. "Nothing that concerns you." Mercer smiled. It was the kind of smile that was meant to be charming, but carried something harder underneath it. "I'm just being friendly." "I know." She set the glass down. "I'm not looking for friendly." The Marines at the far end of the bar had gone quiet. Not because they thought anything serious was about to happen, but because they recognized the beginning of something. They had seen Mercer work a room. They had never seen him hit a wall. "You're alone," he said, as if this were an accusation. "Yes." "That doesn't seem like a good time." "I'm having a fine time." "You're drinking water." "I'm aware of what I'm drinking." He laughed, turned back toward his Marines with the laugh, sharing it, pulling them into his moment. "She's drinking water," he announced, and a few of them smiled obediently. He turned back to Rachel. "At a bar, on a Friday." She finally looked at him, not a long look, just enough to land it. "Some of us don't need to be loud to enjoy ourselves." The smile on Mercer's face shifted. It stayed in place, but something behind it changed. Dennis, who had been moving slowly down the bar, pretending to wipe down surfaces, caught it and felt his stomach tighten. "That a dig at me?" Mercer asked. "It's an observation." "About me." "If it applies." The bar had gotten quieter, in the way bars get quiet, when the room senses something real is underneath what's being said. 2 of Mercer's Marines exchanged a look. One of them, a corporal named Hayes, medium-build, sharp eyes, took a half-step forward and then stopped himself. "Staff Sergeant, maybe we should—" "I got it, Hayes." Mercer didn't look at him. He was looking at Rachel with the concentrated focus of a man who had decided something. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Rachel picked up her glass again. "I don't need to." "I've been deployed twice, Iraq and Afghanistan. I've been in combat." "I believe you." "Then why are you talking to me like—" "I'm not talking to you at all," she said, and her voice was so flat and honest that it cut right through the performance. "You came and sat next to me. I answered your questions. I've been very clear that I want to be left alone." She turned back to her water. "So, please go back to your friends." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This one had weight. Mercer stayed on the stool and didn't move, and the fact that he didn't move told Dennis everything. This man was not going to let this go, not because he had a legitimate grievance, but because there were 8 Marines watching, and a woman had just dismissed him with more efficiency than anyone had in recent memory. "You got a problem with military?" Mercer asked. "No, because you're sitting in a bar full of people who serve—" "I'm aware of that." "And you're acting like we're beneath you." Rachel set her glass down very carefully. She turned and looked at him with the same level, unhurried expression she might use to read a road sign. "I am not acting like anything. I am sitting quietly and drinking water. I have not insulted you. I have not been rude to your friends. I have not made any comment about the military or anyone in it." A beat. "You came to me. I have asked you 3 times to leave. I'm asking you one more time, and I want you to hear me clearly." She held his gaze. "Walk away." Mercer's jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck stood out. Behind him, Dennis heard someone set a bottle down very slowly, the way you move when you don't want to make noise and draw attention to yourself. "You don't talk to me like that," Mercer said. "I just did." One of the older Marines at the back of the group, a sergeant named Kowalski, who had his own deployment patches and had been watching this exchange with growing unease, leaned toward Hayes and said quietly, "Get him back here." Hayes moved. "Staff Sergeant, come on, let's—" "Back off, Hayes. Seriously, man, let's just—" "I said back off." Hayes stopped. He looked at Rachel. She was watching Mercer the way you watch a car that might or might not run a red light without panic, without anger, with the specific calibrated attention of someone calculating odds. Kowalski put his drink down. He walked the length of the bar himself, not rushing, and touched Mercer's arm. "Ryan, let's go." Mercer looked at him. "She's not worth it," Kowalski said, and immediately something shifted in Rachel's expression. Not hurt exactly, but something that sharpened. "Nobody asked your opinion," Rachel said, and she was looking at Kowalski now. He blinked. I know what you're doing and I don't need it. I'm not a situation that needs managing." She turned back to Mercer. "I'm a person sitting alone at a bar who has asked to be left alone. That's it. That's the whole situation." Mercer let Kowalski pull him back one step, just one, and Dennis thought for a moment that the thing was going to bleed off, that the tension was going to find somewhere to go that wasn't catastrophic. Then one of the younger Marines at the back said something. Dennis didn't catch all of it, just the words, "think she's too good." And Mercer heard it, and whatever restraint he had been maintaining dissolved. He turned back. "You think you're better than us?" It wasn't a question anymore. Rachel looked at her water. "I think I'd like to finish this and go home." "You don't get to just sit there and make everybody feel stupid. I haven't said a word to anybody except you. Your whole attitude, Ryan." Kowalski again, sharper this time. "Walk away." But Mercer was past hearing anything that wasn't the sound of his own conviction. He stepped back to the bar. He leaned in close enough that Dennis put his hand on the edge of the counter and prepared to move. "What are you even doing here?" Mercer said low, now ugly. "You don't belong in a place like this. You don't know what these men have been through. You don't know what sacrifice looks like." Rachel was quiet for 3 full seconds. When she spoke, her voice was very soft. "You need to stop talking now." "Or what?" She turned and looked at him with complete stillness. "Or what?" he said again louder, and the bar had gone so quiet that Dennis could hear the ice settling in the glasses down the line. She said for the last time, "Walk away from me." He didn't. What happened next lasted less than 4 seconds, but burned itself into the memory of every person who witnessed it with the clarity of something recorded. Mercer's hand came up. The motion was not entirely deliberate. It was the overflow of everything that had been building: the humiliation in the audience and the bourbon, and the particular kind of fury that comes from being calmly refused by someone who should, in his calculation, have been afraid of him. His palm connected with the side of her face with a crack that Dennis felt in his sternum. The room stopped. Rachel's head moved with the impact, turning a few degrees to the right. She sat perfectly still for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then she turned back. And the expression on her face was not what anyone expected. Not anger, not shock, not tears, not the flushed, trembling response of someone who has been hurt and is trying to process it in front of strangers. What Dennis saw, what every Marine in that bar saw, was a kind of absolute stillness that made the hair on his arms stand up. Her eyes found Mercer's with no urgency, no heat. "That," she said quietly, "was a mistake." Mercer laughed. It was a defensive sound, half real, aimed at his Marines trying to pull the room back toward him. "Yeah. What are you going to—" She raised her right hand slowly and touched the side of her face where his hand had landed, not rubbing it, not nursing it. just confirming something to herself the way you press on a bruise to determine its severity. Then she lowered her hand and placed both palms flat on the bar counter. "I'm going to give you one more chance," she said, "because I believe in giving people chances." Hayes took 3 steps forward. Kowalski was already moving. "Staff Sergeant, we need to—" Mercer wasn't done. He was past done. He stepped into her space again, and his hand came up a second time, and that was when Rachel Carter stopped giving chances. It happened so fast that 3 of the Marines present would later struggle to reconstruct the sequence of events even immediately afterward. One moment, Mercer was looming over her. The next, his arm was caught, his weight redirected by some principle of physics that he had not anticipated, and the bar stool beside her was empty, and he was on the floor. Not thrown, not slammed, placed. As if she had simply decided where he should be and moved him there. He lay on his back, looking up at the ceiling of the iron anchor bar, and every person in that room stared down at him. Nobody cheered. Nobody laughed. Nobody said a word. Because the silence wasn't the silence of entertainment. It was the silence of recognition. The slow, uncomfortable understanding that they had all been watching something they didn't fully understand, and that the woman now calmly sitting back on her stool and returning her hands to the counter had just demonstrated a category of skill that belonged to a very specific world. Hayes crouched down beside Mercer. "You okay?" Mercer sat up slowly. He looked at his hands. He looked at Rachel's back. He looked around the bar at the faces of his Marines looking for something in them. Solidarity, maybe, or confirmation that what had just happened wasn't what it looked like. He found neither. "Who?" He stopped, cleared his throat, started again. "Who is she?" Dennis leaned on the counter. He looked at Rachel. She had picked up her glass of water and was drinking from it with the same careful economy she had shown all evening, as if the last 90 seconds had been a minor interruption in an otherwise unremarkable night. "I don't know," Dennis said, and that was the truth. But Kowalski, standing at the edge of the group with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the expression of a man privately reconsidering several recent decisions, said nothing at all. Because Kowalski had seen something when Rachel moved. Something in the geometry of it. The way she had used Mercer's own forward momentum as the mechanism of his landing. The precision of it. The complete absence of wasted energy. He had spent 11 years in the Marine Corps. He had trained alongside operators from multiple branches. He had been through MCMAP and gotten his instructor certification and thought he understood the upper end of what close-quarters trained personnel looked like in motion. He was no longer certain he did. He walked to the bar and sat down 2 stools from Rachel. He didn't look at her directly. He stared at the bottles behind the counter and said quietly enough that only she could hear it. "I apologize for what I said earlier. The not worth it thing." Rachel took a sip of water. "You didn't deserve that framing," Kowalski said. A moment passed. "No," she said simply. "I didn't." He nodded once. He ordered a beer. He didn't say anything else, and neither did she, and that was the end of the conversation, and somehow it was both completely inadequate and exactly right. Behind them, Hayes was helping Mercer to his feet. The younger Marines had rearranged themselves into the shape of people who needed to look busy, checking phones, talking to each other about nothing, performing the ordinary motions of a Friday night, with the slightly too careful effort of people who had just witnessed something they needed to file away and process later. Dennis refilled Rachel's water without being asked. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, moved on down the bar. Mercer straightened his shirt. He rubbed the back of his head where it had connected with the floor, not hard enough to do damage, but hard enough to remind him. He looked at Rachel one more time. She did not look back. That was, in the end, the most devastating thing. Not what she had done to him. Not the efficiency of it or the speed or the complete absence of drama. The most devastating thing was that after it was over, after he was on the floor and back on his feet and standing 10 feet away from her, she had already moved on. He was simply no longer relevant to her evening, and for a man who had built his entire identity around being the person other people couldn't ignore, That was the thing that stayed with him. Long after his head stopped hurting, long after the bar closed, long after the story started spreading the way stories do in tight-knit military communities, moving through channels at a speed that would have surprised Rachel had she known about it, long after everything else. What he remembered lying awake at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling of his quarters was not the floor, was not the physical facts of what had happened to him. It was that she had given him chances. Multiple chances. Clear, direct, unhurried. She had told him exactly what she wanted, exactly what the limit was, exactly what would happen if he crossed it. And he had crossed it anyway because he had not believed her, because she was quiet, because she was drinking water, because she was sitting alone, because in his understanding of how the world worked, those things meant something about the kind of person she was. He had been wrong. He had been so catastrophically, completely, irreversibly wrong. And somewhere across town in a modest house, 3 blocks from the water, Rachel Carter washed her face and looked at the faint pink mark on her cheek in the bathroom mirror and thought about how exhausting it was to still have to do this. To still have to be this. To have spent years learning how to be invisible and still have someone find the one thread she had left exposed and pull on it until something unraveled. She turned off the light. She went to bed. She was not angry. She was something more complicated than angry. Something that had no clean name in any language she had ever learned, something that lived in the place where exhaustion and resignation and the stubborn, unkillable instinct for self-preservation all came together and just kept burning. In the morning, she would go back to being invisible. But tonight, the quiet woman at the end of the bar had reminded an entire room of something they would spend a long time thinking about. And in the slow, serious way that military communities have of processing events that don't fit their existing frameworks. The story of what happened at the Iron Anchor on a Friday night in Harbor Point had already begun its long, complicated journey toward the truth of who Rachel Carter really was. Corporal Marcus Hayes did not sleep that night. He lay on his rack in the barracks and stared at the underside of the bunk above him, and replayed what he had seen at the Iron Anchor with the methodical attention he usually reserved for after-action reviews. He ran it forward. He ran it backward. He paused it at the moment Mercer hit the floor and tried to reconstruct the mechanics of how it happened, because he had been standing 8 feet away with an unobstructed line of sight, and he still could not fully account for what his eyes had recorded. It was not that she had been fast. Fast was something Hayes understood. He had trained with fast people, people who could throw a combination in the time it took most men to register the first punch had been thrown. Speed was a variable he knew how to process. This was not speed. Or it was not only speed. What Rachel Carter had done to Mercer was something that operated at a different level than speed. It was more like, and Hayes spent a long time trying to find the right word for it, lying in the dark of the barracks, it was more like geometry. Like she had a precise understanding of where every pound of Mercer's weight was going to be at every moment, and she had simply redirected the architecture of the situation until the outcome she wanted was the only outcome available. Hayes had seen that once before. Once. In a training session at Camp Pendleton 2 years ago, when a retired MARSOC operator had come in to run a combatives workshop. The man was 60 years old and built like a philosophy professor, and he had put 3 instructors on the floor in succession without breaking a sweat. And when Hayes asked him afterward how he did it, the man had smiled and said, "I stopped fighting people a long time ago. Now I just helped them fall." Rachel Carter had helped Mercer fall. Hayes sat up on his rack at 4 a.m. and reached for the small challenge coin he had found on the floor of the Iron Anchor, the one that had slipped from the edge of the bar stool when Rachel stood up. He had picked it up without thinking, the automatic habit of a Marine who had been trained that challenge coins on the floor were disrespectful to whoever had earned them. He turned it over in his fingers in the dark. The front face had an eagle, not the Marine eagle, not the Army eagle. Something slightly different in the angle of the wings and the arrangement of the elements around it. The back had a trident, and below the trident a number, and below that number a phrase in Latin that Hayes did not recognize. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions. He was 24 years old and he had been a Marine for 3 years, and in that time he had learned that the most dangerous thing a junior enlisted person could do was mistake a partial picture for a complete one. But he had grown up in a Navy family. His father had done 22 years, his uncle 18, his older brother was currently stationed at Little Creek. And he had heard enough family dinners and enough late nights on porches with men who did not talk about their work unless they thought no one important was listening to recognize the shape of what he was holding. He closed his fist around the coin. In the morning, he was going to make a phone call. Mercer came to PT the next morning. That surprised some of the junior Marines who had expected him to call in sick to manufacture some reason not to appear. Instead, he was there at 0600 in his PT gear, and he ran the 3 miles at pace, and he did not mention the previous night once. He did not look at Hayes. He did not gather his usual audience before the run. He just did the work and dismissed the formation and went back to his quarters. Kowalski fell in beside Hayes as they walked back. "How's he doing?" Hayes asked. "How do you think?" Kowalski didn't slow his pace. He got put on the floor by a woman half his size in a room full of his own Marines. He put his hands on her first. "I know that." "So he's lucky she—" "I know that too." Kowalski stopped walking. He waited until the other Marines had moved far enough ahead that the conversation was private. He looked at Hayes with an expression that was not quite concern and not quite warning, but something that combined elements of both. "What you got in your hand?" Hayes opened his fist. Kowalski looked at the coin for a long moment without touching it. "Where'd you get that?" "She dropped it. At the bar." Kowalski said nothing. "You recognize it?" Hayes asked. "I recognize the shape of what I don't recognize," Kowalski said, which is more than most people would. He looked up at Hayes. "Put it away. Don't show that to anyone else." "Why?" "Because there are things in this world that other people are not supposed to know about, and the fact that you're holding something connected to those things in your hand at 0600 outside a barracks building means you need to be very careful about what you do next." He paused. "You understand me." Hayes understood him. He put the coin away, but he made the phone call anyway. His brother Danny picked up on the second ring, which meant he was on shore and not mid-rotation, which was good. Hayes kept it brief. He described the coin, the eagle, the trident, the Latin phrase, the number, and he described what he had seen at the bar, just the mechanics of it, just the facts stripped of editorial. There was a long silence on the other end. "Danny?" "I heard you. You recognize any of that?" Another silence. Longer this time. "Where did you say this happened?" "Harbor Point. The Iron Anchor." "And she's still there in Harbor Point?" "I don't know. She left the bar. I don't know where she went." "What did she look like?" Hayes described her. Height, build, approximate age, the scar along the jaw. The silence after that was the longest of all three. "Danny, talk to me." "I can't talk to you about this," his brother said, and his voice had changed. Not cold exactly, but careful in a way that Hayes had only heard once before, when Danny had called to say he was deploying somewhere he couldn't name, and Hayes shouldn't ask. "Not on this phone. Not right now." "Is she Marcus?" Danny used his first name, which he almost never did. "I need you to listen to me. Whatever happened last night, whatever you think you saw, the correct thing to do right now is return that coin to her and walk away from this entire situation." "She left it. I understand that. I understand she left it. But it doesn't belong to you, and the less you know about where it came from, the better off you're going to be. Trust me on that." A beat. "Did anyone else see it?" "Kowalski." "Who's Kowalski?" "Sergeant. Good Marine. Smart. Smart enough to keep his mouth shut." "I think so. Yeah. Okay." Danny exhaled. "Okay, that's fine. That's manageable. But Marcus, I need you to hear me say this one time, and then we're going to hang up and talk about Mom's birthday. Like normal people, whoever that woman is, whatever she's running from, or walking away from, or trying to build out there, she earned every bit of the privacy she's got, and she earned it in ways that you and I and Kowalski and Sergeant Mercer all together don't have the right to question. You hear me? Hayes heard him. After he hung up, he sat for a long time looking at the coin in his palm. Earned every bit of the privacy she's got. He thought about the way she had sat at that bar. The positioning. The exits. The coin itself small enough to fit in a closed fist, specific enough to mean something to the people who needed it to mean something obscure enough to be invisible to everyone else. She hadn't lost it. He was almost certain now that she hadn't lost it. She had left it. The question was why. Rachel Carter woke at 5:15 without an alarm, made coffee in the small kitchen of her rented house, and stood at the window drinking it while the sky outside went through its slow transformation from black to gray to the thin particular blue of early morning on the California coast. She had 3 missed calls on her phone, all from the same number, all from the last 2 hours. She had not answered them. She put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and finished her coffee and washed the mug and set it in the drying rack. She changed into running clothes. She went out. She ran 6 miles. Hard sustained the kind of pace that made thought impossible, which was the point. She had discovered in the years after leaving the program that the only reliable way to silence the part of her brain that never fully disengaged from threat assessment was to give her body something demanding enough to drown it out. Running did that. The cold morning air did that. The rhythm of footfall on pavement, lungs burning, pulse elevated. The world narrowed to the next 50 yards, and then the next 50 yards after that. She was not running from last night. She needed to be clear about that, even in her own mind. She was not frightened by what had happened. She was not rattled. She was not doing the thing that people who didn't know her might assume she was doing, processing trauma, burning off adrenaline, trying to outrun a bad memory. She was running because she had always run every morning in every city in every country where she had spent more than 48 consecutive hours, and that routine was one of the things she had kept from her former life because it was hers, before it was the military's, and she refused to give it up. But somewhere around mile 4, as she turned inland and pushed up the long grade of Harborview Drive, she allowed herself to think about the coin. She knew she had left it. She had felt it slip from the edge of the stool in the confusion of standing up, and she had made the deliberate choice to leave it. She had made that choice in approximately 1 second, which was the amount of time she typically allotted to decisions of moderate consequence, and she had made it for reasons she was still evaluating. Part of it was a test. She had been in Harbor Point for 6 weeks, and in 6 weeks she had constructed the careful, deliberate architecture of a life that did not invite scrutiny. She bought groceries at the small market on Cedar Street. She ran in the early morning. She volunteered twice a week at the Veterans Resource Center on Maple, doing administrative work, filing paperwork, answering phones, nothing that required her to explain who she was or what she knew. She kept the house clean and the curtains halfway closed, and she spoke to her neighbors with the pleasant, adequate friendliness of someone who is nice but not available for friendship. She had been watching. That was the other part. She had been watching this particular corner of Harbor Point for 6 weeks, and what she had been watching for was not something she could explain to anyone who had not spent years doing the kind of work she used to do. It was a pattern, a shape in the noise. A set of coincidences that were not quite coincidental enough. The bar last night had not been accidental. She had chosen it deliberately. She had chosen the night deliberately. She had sat at the far end of the bar and been visible in the specific way she needed to be visible, and she had left the coin in the specific place she needed to leave it, and now the question was what came back. She crested the hill and started down the other side. The harbor spread out below her in the early light, and she thought about Corporal Hayes, who had quick eyes and a careful face, and who had picked up the coin with the instinctive reverence of someone who understood what challenge coins meant. She thought about what he would do with it. She thought about who he would call. She ran the last 2 miles back to the house, and showered and changed, and picked up her phone, and looked at the 3 missed calls again. Then she called back. It rang once. "I heard there was an incident," the voice said. No greeting. No preamble. "There was a situation," Rachel said. "It's resolved." The coin, intentional. A pause. Rachel, I need 2 more weeks. You were supposed to be 2 weeks ago. I know. I needed more time to establish the pattern. We don't have 2 weeks, she said again, and her voice had the quality it always had when she was done negotiating. Not hard, not aggressive, but completely final, like a door that has been closed and locked from the inside. I know what I'm doing. I know what's here. Give me 2 weeks and I will hand you something that doesn't fall apart in court. Another pause. Longer. The Marine. The one from last night. Is he going to be a problem? Rachel thought about Mercer on the floor of the Iron Anchor, looking up at the ceiling with the expression of a man whose map of the world had just been redrawn without his permission. No, she said. He's going to be fine. And the corporal? The one who picked up the coin. She paused for just a fraction of a second too long, and the person on the other end of the phone was good enough to notice. Rachel, he's not a problem, she said. He's potentially an asset. An asset. The voice was dry. You've been there 6 weeks and you're already recruiting. I'm not recruiting. I'm observing. There's a difference. There's a very thin difference when you're operating outside your authorization. I'm always operating outside my authorization. That's why you send me. The silence that followed was the kind that meant the person on the other end was smiling despite themselves. 2 weeks, they said finally. Thank you. And Rachel, don't hit anyone else. She ended the call. The story had spread by Monday morning. This was the way of things in tight-knit military communities. Events that happened on Friday night at a local bar were common knowledge by the following weekend, and what had happened at the Iron Anchor was the kind of event that moved fast. Not because anyone was gossiping maliciously, because it was genuinely extraordinary, and people who deal in physical capability and tactical awareness for a living tend to be deeply interested in situations that challenge their understanding of what physical capability and tactical awareness look like. By Monday, 3 versions were in circulation. In the first version, Rachel was a former Marine Corps martial arts instructor who had been dishonorably discharged for excessive force and had moved to Harbor Point to disappear. This version was the least interesting and therefore the least popular. In the second version, she was a civilian contractor who had spent time embedded with special operations units overseas and had been through enough informal training to approximate the real thing. This version had more traction because it accounted for the precision of what people had witnessed without requiring them to accept something they weren't prepared to accept. The third version, the one that circulated in quieter conversations between people with more experience, spoken in the careful shorthand of men who had spent enough time around classified operations to know when they were adjacent to one. The third version said simply that nobody knew who she was, and that itself was a significant piece of information. Kowalski was the source of the third version. He had not said anything specific. He had not described the coin or Hayes's phone call or any particular detail. He had simply responded to questions about the woman at the bar with a measured silence that communicated more than words would have, and experienced Marines read that silence correctly. Mercer heard all 3 versions. He processed them the way he processed everything uncomfortable by not processing them by pushing them into a space he didn't look at directly, by throwing himself into the physical routine of the duty week with enough intensity to keep his mind occupied. He was in the gym by 05 on Monday. He ran extra miles. He pushed the junior Marines through a combative session in the afternoon with a focus and precision that he privately knew was overcompensation, but couldn't stop. And then, at the end of the duty day, he did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He asked Kowalski who to talk to. About what? Kowalski said. They were in the parking lot. Everyone else had headed out. Mercer was in his civilian clothes keys in hand, standing with a posture that was slightly different from his usual, not exactly smaller, not deflated, but recalibrated. The aggressive forward lean gone. Something beneath the surface rearranged. About what happened, Mercer said. About who she might be. I put my hands on someone, and I need to understand what I did. Kowalski looked at him for a moment. Why? He asked. Not hostile, genuinely curious. Mercer looked at his keys. Because I've been telling myself for 3 days that it doesn't matter. That she got what she needed, I got what I had coming, and now we move on. He paused. And I can't do it. I can't just move on without understanding what I walked into. You walked into a woman who wanted to be left alone. I know that. That's the whole story, Ryan. You walked into a woman who asked you to leave her alone 5 times, and you didn't, and she handled it. She didn't just handle it. Mercer looked up. People don't move like that. Not civilians. She's not a civilian. The words sat between them in the cooling evening air. How do you know that? Mercer said quietly. Kowalski said nothing. Kowalski. How do you know that? I've been around long enough to recognize the shape of things I'm not supposed to know about, Kowalski said. And that's all I'm going to say. He looked at Mercer steadily. Go home. Do your job. Be better than you were Friday night. A pause. That's the whole assignment. Mercer drove home. He did not sleep. Hayes found her on Wednesday. Not by tracking her, not by investigating. He simply ran into her at the Veterans Resource Center on Maple Street, where he had been volunteering sporadically since his first deployment, answering phones on his off days, because the center was chronically understaffed, and because it made him feel less useless in the weeks between training cycles. She was at the filing cabinet when he walked in. She had her back to the door, and she was sorting papers with the same economical attention she brought to everything apparently. And for a moment, Hayes stood in the doorway processing the coincidence until he realized it might not be one. She turned around before he said anything, which meant she had heard him, or she had not needed to hear him, had registered the change in air pressure or light or some signal Hayes didn't consciously produce, but apparently could not suppress. Corporal Hayes, she said. He blinked. You know my name. You were at the bar Friday night. She turned back to the filing cabinet. You tried to stop your staff sergeant twice before the situation escalated. That suggested you were either reasonable or afraid. And you didn't look afraid. Hayes walked to the front desk and set his bag down. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and put the challenge coin on the corner of the filing cabinet beside her. She looked at it without touching it. You could have kept it, she said. It's not mine. A pause. She picked it up, turned it once in her fingers, set it in her own pocket. You called someone, she said. It was not a question. My brother, Hayes said. He's Navy. He didn't tell me anything. I know he didn't. But his not telling me told me something. She looked at him then. Full attention, the same way she had looked at Mercer in the bar, right before everything changed, not with calculation this time, but with something that Hayes could only describe as assessment. Like she was running a fast calibration on who he was and what she could do with the result. What do you volunteer here? She asked. Phones mostly, some filing. They needed people and I had time. How long? 8 months on and off. She nodded once slowly, as if he had answered a question she had not asked aloud. She turned back to the cabinet and resumed filing. There's a man who comes in here, she said, her voice even and informational. Thursdays. Retired Army 63 lives alone over on Birchwood. He served in the Gulf, did another stretch as a contractor after his discharge. He's been coming in for about 4 months. She paused, pulled out a folder, put it in a different section. In the last 6 weeks, he has come in 3 times asking questions about veteran benefit disbursement processes, not his own benefits. General process questions, procedural. Hayes was quiet. He's also been asking about the community liaison officer, she said. What their authority is, what records they have access to, what they share with federal agencies. She closed the filing cabinet and turned around. I notice things, she said simply. Hayes thought about what his brother had said. Earned every bit of the privacy she's got. What are you doing here? He asked. She looked at him steadily. Volunteering, she said. And Hayes, who was 24 years old and had good instincts and had been a Marine for 3 years and had spent 4 nights now reconstructing the geometry of what had happened at the Iron Anchor, understood that this was both the complete truth and simultaneously the smallest possible fraction of it. "The man on Thursdays," he said. "What's his name?" Rachel picked up the next folder and walked to the second filing cabinet. "Garrett," she said. "Paul Garrett." She opened the drawer. "He'll be in tomorrow," she said. Hayes pulled up a chair. He sat down. He did not ask another question, and she did not offer another answer. And they worked in the quiet of the resource center for the rest of the afternoon, with the particular focused silence of 2 people who have just, without formally discussing it or agreeing to it, decided to trust each other. Outside, the sun finished its descent, and the streetlights came on one by one down Maple and Harbor Point, settled into the ordinary rhythms of a Wednesday evening, and nobody on the outside of that building would have guessed that inside it something had shifted. The shape of the pattern Rachel Carter had been building for 6 weeks had just acquired a new element, and the story of who she really was, the story that Mercer had stumbled into without understanding what he was stumbling into, the story that Hayes had been circling since Friday night, the story that a retired Army contractor named Paul Garrett would have done almost anything to prevent from being told, that story had just moved one step closer to the surface. Paul Garrett walked into the Veterans Resource Center at 9:17 on Thursday morning, which was 11 minutes earlier than his previous 3 visits. Hayes noticed that immediately. He had come in at 8, told the regular volunteer coordinator he wanted extra hours this week, and positioned himself at the front desk with a phone to answer and a stack of intake forms to process and a clear line of sight to the door. Rachel was in the back office. She had been there since 7:30 doing something on the center's computer that she had not explained and that Hayes had not asked about. Garrett was 63 medium height, carrying the particular kind of weight that accumulates on men who were once very physically capable and then stopped the muscle softening, but the frame remaining, so that he still looked substantial, even though the substance had changed quality. He had a Gulf War veteran's pin on his jacket. He carried a manila folder under his left arm. He smiled when he saw Hayes. "Morning," Garrett said. "You knew. Been here a few months," Hayes said. "How can I help you?" "I've got some questions about the disbursement timeline for disability adjustments." He set the folder on the counter and opened it. "I was told there was a new processing window that started in October, and I want to make sure my documentation is in the right format." Hayes looked at the folder. The documentation inside it was real, legitimate veteran benefit paperwork, correctly filled, properly dated. He had spent enough time at the center to know what legitimate paperwork looked like, and this was it, which told him something. A man who brought real paperwork to cover a visit where the paperwork was not the point was a man who understood misdirection. "Let me get our resources coordinator," Hayes said. "She knows the new processing windows better than I do." He went to the back office and knocked once. Rachel was at the computer. She did not look up. "He's here," Hayes said quietly. 11 minutes early. Real paperwork, Gulf War pin friendly. "What's in the folder?" "Disability adjustment forms, legitimate." She was quiet for a moment. Her eyes were still on the screen. "Is he alone?" Hayes thought about it. He had looked through the glass when Garrett approached, and he had been alone on the sidewalk, but that wasn't what she was asking. "I don't know," he said honestly. She looked up at him then. Something in her expression shifted, not approval exactly, but acknowledgement. The right answer was, "I don't know," not a confident yes that papered over uncertainty. "Tell him I'll be right out," she said. "Offer him coffee. Watch where his eyes go when you're not looking directly at him." Hayes went back out. Garrett accepted the coffee. He stood at the counter, not sitting down, which meant he wanted mobility. His eyes, when Hayes was ostensibly looking down at the intake form, moved once to the back hallway and once to the front window. He was checking exits. Hayes kept his face neutral and his voice friendly and wrote nothing down. Rachel came out 2 minutes later with a printed copy of the October processing timeline and a smile that was warm and completely professional and contained nothing that would have told a stranger she was anything other than a knowledgeable volunteer. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "I'm Rachel. I understand you have questions about the new disbursement format." Garrett looked at her, just for a moment, half a second, maybe less. Something moved behind his eyes. Not recognition exactly. Something more like the activation of an instinct he had learned to trust over a long career of situations where the wrong read got people killed. Then it was gone, and he was smiling, and he was pulling the folder open and asking his questions about processing windows. Rachel answered them. Every answer was correct. Every answer was delivered with the mild, helpful energy of someone who had been doing this work for years, and Hayes, watching from the desk, found himself genuinely awed by the performance, not because it was theatrical, but because it was not. There was nothing to see. There was no seam between the person he had watched at the Iron Anchor and the person who was calmly walking Paul Garrett through VA documentation protocols. She was not performing calm. She was calm. And beneath the calm, absolutely everything was engaged. "You're very knowledgeable," Garrett said near the end. "I've been doing this a while," Rachel said. "You serve—" A half-beat pause. "The first one." "My father did," she said. "I grew up around it." Garrett nodded. He was closing the folder. He was done with the paperwork portion of the visit, Hayes could see that. And now came the part Hayes had been waiting for. "One more thing," Garrett said, casual, shoulders relaxed. "I had a question about the community liaison, the officer who coordinates with federal agencies." Rachel looked at him with pleasant attention. "What would you like to know?" "I've heard that position has access to veteran records beyond the standard disclosure window. Case history, service documentation. I want to make sure my own records are protected appropriately." Rachel tilted her head slightly. "All veteran records are protected under federal privacy law. The liaison position doesn't have any special access that you haven't specifically authorized. But the position does interface with federal law enforcement. On specific authorized requests. Yes. And those requests, are they logged? Is there a record of when a veteran's file has been accessed by an outside agency?" Rachel held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds before answering, long enough to register the question fully, short enough that it didn't read as hesitation. "That's a question I'd direct to the liaison officer directly," she said. "I can give you her contact information, or if you'd prefer, I can flag your file with a notification request so you're automatically informed anytime your records are accessed." Garrett went very still. It was subtle. A man less practiced at reading people than Rachel Carter would have missed it entirely. But Hayes saw it too, from the desk, the micro-stillness of a person who has just heard something unexpected and is processing whether it is a problem. "A notification request," Garrett repeated. "Standard option. A lot of veterans request it. Takes about 10 minutes to set up." A pause. "I'll think about it," he said. He took the processing timeline Rachel had printed. He thanked her. He thanked Hayes. He left. The door closed behind him. Hayes waited 30 seconds. "He came for information about the liaison officer," he said. "He came to find out what we know," Rachel said, and her voice had returned to the mode Hayes had heard on Wednesday, flat and precise, and completely stripped of the professional warmth she had aimed at Garrett. "He's been doing it for months. Small visits. Different questions that circled the same target." She walked to the window, not to watch Garrett, Hayes realized, but to confirm the direction he went. The notification request rattled him. Will he come back? Not here. She turned from the window. He has what he needed. He knows the liaison officer's access logs can be flagged. She paused. Which means whoever he's protecting is going to move faster now. Hayes felt the implications of that settle in his chest. "Who's he protecting?" Hayes asked. Rachel looked at him. "That," she said, "is what I've spent 6 weeks finding out." She told him in pieces. Not out of caginess, he understood that, now understood that she did not operate in unnecessary caginess, but because the story was complicated and the pieces needed to land in the right order for the structure to make sense. Paul Garrett had not always been a man who asked careful questions in veterans' resource centers. He had spent 11 years in Army intelligence after his Gulf deployment, working in a capacity he could not legally discuss, doing things that had been genuinely important and genuinely necessary, and in some cases, genuinely catastrophic. And when he separated from the Army, he had taken a contractor position with a private defense consulting firm called Redgate Solutions. Redgate was real. It was registered. It had federal contracts and a legitimate client list and offices in 3 cities and a website that said all the right things about veteran employment and national security support. It was also, Rachel had come to believe, the operational front for a scheme that had been running for 9 years and had cost the federal government, meaning the taxpayers, meaning the people who funded every military base and veterans center and disbursement program in the country, somewhere in the range of $40 million. Hayes listened without interrupting. They found a structural gap in the veteran benefit allocation process, Rachel said. Not a glitch, a gap that existed by design, actually, because the system was built in a way that prioritized processing speed over verification accuracy. Redgate identified veterans who were deceased or severely incapacitated, and they created paper trails that rerouted those benefits. Small amounts per case. Dozens of cases. Run it long enough, it becomes a very large number. And Garrett is the liaison. He has relationships with multiple veterans centers in this region. He spent 4 months mapping which organizations have federal notification protocols and which don't. She paused. This center didn't, until 3 weeks ago when I asked the coordinator to implement one. Hayes stared at her. You've been here for 6 weeks, he said slowly. Yes. And in that time you've been building a record of his visits, his questions, the pattern. Yes. For who? The question hung in the air between them. Rachel held it there for a moment, not evasively, but with the specific weight of someone deciding how much of a true answer to give. For the people who asked me to find out what was happening here, she said finally. Naval Criminal Investigative Service, in coordination with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Hayes said nothing for a long moment. You're active, he said. I'm consulting. That's a distinction that matters legally, she said, and one that requires me to not explain it further. He absorbed that. He looked at the counter where Garrett's folder had been gone, now taken with him. The coin, Hayes said. You left it deliberately. I needed to know if anyone in this community had the training to recognize what it was and the judgment to handle it correctly. She met his eyes. You did both. Hayes felt something in his chest that was not quite pride and not quite discomfort, but occupied the space between them. He had been selected, not by accident, by a process of assessment he hadn't known he was part of. What do you need from me? He said. Thursday next week, Garrett is going to come back, she said. He won't come here. He'll go to a different center. There's one in Millbrook, 15 miles north, that doesn't have the notification protocol. He's going to access records there, and he's going to believe he's doing it without anyone watching. She looked at Hayes steadily. I need someone he has no reason to associate with me to be there. Hayes understood. I have family in Millbrook, he said after a moment. I volunteer there sometimes. I know, she said. Of course she did. The call came that night at 10:45 when Hayes was back in the barracks and Rachel was at the kitchen table in her house on the water with a cup of tea and a laptop and the specific cold focus of someone who had reached the most dangerous part of a long operation. The voice on the phone was not the same voice she had spoken to on Sunday morning. This one was higher, tighter, carrying the controlled urgency of someone accustomed to bad news but not reconciled to it. We have a problem, the voice said. Rachel set her tea down. Tell me. Redgate knows they're being looked at. We don't know how. It may be internal, maybe something in the court filing for the parallel investigation in Virginia, but they know, and they're moving to sanitize. Timeline. 72 hours, maybe less. Rachel closed the laptop. Where are they starting? Harbor Point. A pause. Rachel, they're starting in Harbor Point. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Garrett, she said. He made 4 phone calls in the last 6 hours. We've been tracking his communications for 3 weeks with a warrant. The last call was to a number registered to a shell company connected to Redgate's holding structure. Another pause. He mentioned the notification request. Rachel stood up from the table. He made you, the voice said. Maybe not fully, maybe not your name. But he knows someone at that center is not who they appear to be, and he knows the center is now connected to federal notification protocols that weren't there 2 months ago, and he's smart enough to put those things together. I know he's smart, Rachel said. I've been watching him for 6 weeks. Which means the 6 weeks you spent building a record of his visits is about to mean nothing if they move the money before we can freeze the accounts. She was already walking to the bedroom. I need authorization for an accelerated close. Rachel, an accelerated close means, I know what it means. It means the evidentiary package is incomplete. We go in early, we risk the case. We wait, we lose the money, we lose Garrett, and 9 years of this disappears into the same gap it came from. She opened the closet. I did not spend 6 weeks in Harbor Point to watch this evaporate 72 hours before we had it locked. The voice was quiet. Then, I need to make a call. Make it fast, Rachel said. She hung up. She stood in the middle of her bedroom, in the quiet of the house, and took 3 measured breaths, the kind she had learned to take in the years when 3 measured breaths was sometimes the only preparation available before something that could not be taken back. Then she picked up her phone and called Hayes. He answered before the second ring. I need you to listen carefully, she said. And I need you to tell me right now whether you're in or you need to step back, because what I'm about to ask you is outside the scope of what I originally intended, and I will not hold it against you if the answer is no. A pause on the other end. Brief. I'm in, Hayes said. You don't know what I'm asking yet. Doesn't matter. His voice was steady and certain in the way that surprised her, not because she had underestimated him, but because certainty of that quality was rare in anyone, and rarer still in someone 24 years old. Tell me what you need. What she needed was a presence at the Millbrook Veterans Center before it opened in the morning. Not surveillance. Not anything that would look like surveillance. Simply someone who had an established reason to be there, who could tell her if Garrett arrived early, if he arrived with anyone, if anything about his pattern was different from his established behavior. What she got was Hayes at the Millbrook Center at 7:45 answering phones and filing intake forms and drinking bad coffee from the staff room, looking for all the world like a Marine corporal filling his off day with volunteer hours. What she got was Garrett arriving at 8:20 minutes before the center officially opened, walking to the side entrance that was used by staff and knocking. Hayes texted her one word early. Rachel was already in her car. She texted back, "Anyone with him?" Hayes looked through the interior window. The staff coordinator, a retired Navy man named Walsh, who had run the Millbrook Center for 11 years, and who Hayes genuinely liked, was letting Garrett in with the easy familiarity of people who have been doing this together for a while. Hayes texted Walsh, "Knows him." They're comfortable. No one else. Then he watched Garrett say something to Walsh, and Walsh nod, and Walsh disappear into the back office and come out with a set of files. Real files. Physical files. Hayes took a breath. Not a digital access. Physical records. He texted Rachel. Physical files. Walsh pulled them directly. The response came back in 11 seconds. Walsh is involved. Hayes felt the floor shift under him. Walsh, who had been running the center for 11 years, who ordered birthday cakes for volunteers, and remembered everyone's service branch, and actually cried at the memorial service they held every November. Walsh, who Hayes had trusted instinctively from the first day he walked in. He looked at the man behind the window. Walsh was handing Garrett a folder. Garrett was opening it. Walsh was pointing at something on one of the pages. Hayes stood up from the desk. He walked to the water cooler, which gave him a better angle through the interior window, and he looked at what Garrett was looking at, and he read the tab on the folder. He read it twice to make sure. The name on the folder tab was Carter R. His stomach dropped. He was already typing when Rachel's second message came through. His text, Garrett has a file. The tab says Carter R. Your file. He stared at the phone. 3 seconds. 5. Then his phone rang. Not a text. A call. He answered it. Where exactly is Garrett standing? Rachel's voice was controlled in the way that things under extreme pressure are controlled, not calm, but directed every unit of available energy pointed at a single purpose. Interior office. Walsh is with him. They have a physical file with your name on it. He kept his voice low. Rachel, how does a Veterans Resource Center have a file on you? Because Garrett has been building one, she said. Every center he's visited, he's been compiling information, cross-referencing volunteer records, tracking who came in when the protocols changed. A beat. He built a profile on whoever disrupted his access pattern. He's been more thorough than I gave him credit for. He knows who you are. He knows who I appeared to be here, she said. The question is whether he's connected it to anything deeper. Her voice did not waver. Hayes, I need you to do something right now, and you need to do it without hesitation. Tell me. Walk into that office. Tell Walsh there's someone at the front who needs immediate help with an emergency benefits claim. Get Garrett out of those files for 60 seconds. Hayes was already moving. He pushed through the interior door without knocking, and Walsh looked up startled, and Garrett looked up with the quick reflexive alertness of someone whose instincts were never fully at rest. Sorry to interrupt, Hayes said, and his voice was perfect, apologetic, slightly harried, every note of a junior volunteer over his head, with a crisis at the front desk. There's a gentleman out front. He's very upset. He says his disability payment was suspended, and he has a hearing tomorrow morning, and he doesn't know what to do. Mr. Walsh, I told him you were the one who could actually help. Walsh was already standing. 11 years of genuine dedication to veterans in need made it automatic. He was around the desk and through the door before he consciously decided to move. Garrett started to follow. I think he'll be more comfortable one-on-one, Hayes said, stepping slightly into the space Garrett was moving toward, not blocking him, just occupying it. He's pretty distressed. Garrett looked at him. Hayes met his eyes with the open, uncomplicated expression of a young Marine who had nothing to hide and no reason to be interesting. Garrett looked back toward the desk. The folder was still open. He had not closed it. He looked at Hayes one more time. Then he walked to the interior window that looked out at the front desk, positioning himself where he could see Walsh, and Hayes realized with a cold drop of understanding where he could also see the front door. He was watching for someone. He was watching for Rachel. Hayes was already texting with one hand behind his back, thumb moving across the screen without looking. He's at the window. He's watching the front door. He's waiting for you. The response came back in 4 seconds. I know. Don't move. Don't react. In approximately 90 seconds, this is going to be resolved. Hayes stood in the interior office and looked at the open folder on the desk, his eyes moving across it with the speed of someone who had been trained to extract information quickly. And in the 30 seconds he had before Garrett turned back, he saw enough. The folder contained a photograph. A printed photograph, slightly grainy, taken from a distance with a long lens. It was Rachel, running. The morning route he now knew she ran every day, the one that took her up Harborview Drive and back down to the coast. She was at the top of the hill, caught mid-stride, and even in a grainy long-lens photograph, there was something in the posture that was unmistakable to anyone who had seen her move. Below the photograph was a printed page of notes, names, dates. The iron anchor bar with a date and a brief notation, physical altercation. Identity, unknown. Below that, the Veterans Center on Maple Street, with a date and the notation notification protocol implemented shortly after volunteer arrival, possible connection. And below that, in handwriting rather than print a single line that made Hayes's chest go tight, cross-reference NCIS consulting roster flag for Redgate Legal. Garrett turned back from the window. Hayes was looking at the water cooler. 90 seconds, Rachel had said. Hayes counted. At 87 seconds, two things happened simultaneously. The front door of the Millbrook Veterans Resource Center opened, and a woman in a dark jacket walked in. Not Rachel, someone Hayes had never seen mid-40s moving with the specific, purposeful economy of someone who had done this walk before in a professional capacity. She went directly to the front desk and showed Walsh something in a leather holder, and Walsh went very still. And Garrett's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something in his face changed. Not fear, not quite, but the particular controlled recalibration of a man who has spent a career in intelligence and knows when a situation has moved past the point where he controls it. He answered the call. He said two words quiet enough that Hayes could not hear them. He listened for 10 seconds. Then he hung up. He looked at the folder on the desk. He looked at the woman at the front talking to Walsh. He looked at Hayes. "You've been very helpful," Garrett said. His voice was composed, professional, the voice of a man who had survived worse than this and who was already calculating his next move. He picked up his own bag, left the folder where it was, and walked toward the front door. The woman in the dark jacket stepped smoothly into his path. She said his name. His full name, middle name included. Garrett stopped. He did not run. He did not make a scene. He stood in the doorway of the Millbrook Veterans Resource Center with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the expression of a man who is choosing very carefully what to do next. And then Rachel Carter walked through the door behind him. She had come in from the side entrance, the staff entrance, the same one Garrett had used. She walked past Hayes without looking at him. She walked to where Garrett was standing, and she stopped 2 feet away from him, and she looked at him with the same level, unhurried attention she had turned on Mercer in the bar 3 weeks ago. But this was not the bar, and this was not Mercer. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. "I thought you looked familiar," he said, "when you were at the Maple Street Center." "I know you did," Rachel said. "You started making calls within 2 hours. You were monitoring my communications. We had a warrant." He processed that, nodded once slowly. "How long?" "The warrant 3 weeks. The investigation." She held his eyes. 9 years. Something in Garrett's face moved. Not remorse, it was too early for that, and she knew better than to expect it. But something. The particular expression of a man who has been very good at something for a very long time and has just discovered that someone else has been equally good at the opposite of it. "My lawyer," he started, "is already being contacted," the woman in the dark jacket said. Garrett looked at Rachel one more time. "You're good," he said. She did not respond to that. She stepped aside to let the woman in the dark jacket do what needed to be done, and she walked back to the desk where the folder lay open, and she looked at the grainy photograph of herself running up Harborview Drive, and she picked it up and looked at it for a moment and then set it back down. Hayes came to stand beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Walsh," Hayes said finally. His voice was quiet. There was something bruised in it. Rachel looked at him. "He genuinely believed he was helping veterans," she said. Garrett convinced him the resource allocation model they were using was a legitimate reform of a broken system. "Walsh doesn't have a financial motive. He's not taking money from this." She paused. "He's a deceived man, not a corrupt one. There's a difference." Hayes looked at Walsh, who was sitting behind the front desk with his hands folded and his face pale, talking to a second person who had come through the front door while Hayes was not paying attention. "It won't feel like a difference to him," Hayes said. "No," Rachel said. "It won't." She picked up the folder. She closed it. She held it and looked at the wall for a moment, and Hayes, who had spent 3 weeks watching her operate with a level of controlled precision that he had not previously understood was possible, saw something in her face that had not been there before. Not doubt, not regret, something more honest than either of those things. The specific private weight of someone who has done their job correctly and still has to live with all the things that doing it correctly cost. The drive back from Millbrook took 22 minutes, and Rachel did not say a single word for 19 of them. Hayes drove. He had offered without being asked, and she had handed him the keys without discussion, and he understood that the silence was not unfriendly. It was the silence of someone running a very complex internal accounting, tallying what had been spent, what had been gained, what the final number looked like when you held it up to the light. He let her have it. At the 19-minute mark, as they came down the coast road, with the harbor appearing on the right, she said, "Garrett will cooperate." Hayes glanced at her. "He's not an ideologue," she said. "He believed in the mission once the Army, the work, the contractor life afterward. Somewhere along the way the mission became the money, but that's a slide that happens incrementally, and there's usually a moment where a man like Garrett knows exactly when it happened and has spent years not looking at that moment directly." She was looking out the window. When his lawyer sits down with him tonight and explains the weight of what the federal government has documented over 9 years, he will cooperate. Because men like Garrett always calculate odds, and the odds will be very clear. And Redgate. Redgate has 7 executives who knew what the company was doing, and 14 who thought they were running a legitimate defense consultancy. She paused. The 7 will argue about who knew what in the order they were hired. It'll be ugly and slow, and the lawyers will be expensive, and in the end, the federal government will recover somewhere between 60 and 70% of the money. Hayes thought about that. Not all of it. Never all of it. Her voice carried no bitterness, just the flat acknowledgement of someone who had learned the hard way that clean endings were a narrative convenience, and real operations ended with percentages. But enough to matter. Enough to mean that the veterans whose benefits were redirected get made whole. That's what matters. He pulled up to the house on the water and stopped the car and handed her back her keys. Neither of them moved to get out. "What happens to you now?" he asked. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been here 6 weeks," he said. "The operation is done. Or the active part is done. So what, you pack up and go somewhere else. Another 6 weeks, another cover." She was quiet for a moment. "Usually," she said. "Usually." He heard the word land. But not this time. She didn't answer that. She got out of the car. The debrief happened the following morning in a conference room at the Federal Building in San Diego, 40 miles south of Harbor Point, and Rachel arrived 12 minutes early, which was her standard practice, and sat at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee and a folder containing the evidentiary record she had been building for 6 weeks, organized chronologically and cross-referenced against the parallel Virginia investigation. The 2 agents who came in after her, Vasquez from NCIS Park, from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, both had the slightly chastened energy of people who owed someone an apology they hadn't fully decided how to phrase. Vasquez set his own folder on the table and said, "The accelerated close worked." "I know it worked," Rachel said. "I was there." "I mean, the Virginia team was able to freeze the Redgate accounts before the wire transfer completed. The timing was tight," Rachel said. 72-hour window, and we moved in 41. What's the total frozen? 38.7 million across 6 accounts. Park opened his laptop. "The shell company structure is more complex than we initially mapped. There are 3 additional holding entities in the Cayman Islands that we're working with Treasury to access, but domestically, we have everything." Rachel absorbed that. 38.7 million. Redirected over 9 years from veterans who were dead or incapacitated and could not protect their own benefits. Men and women who had given the most consequential years of their lives to the country and whose service had been converted by a network of careful, intelligent, patient criminals into a revenue stream. She put her coffee down. "Walsh," she said. Vasquez shifted in his seat. "He's cooperating fully. His attorney has confirmed he had no knowledge of the financial mechanics of what Garrett was doing. He genuinely believed the resource allocation model was a reform initiative." "What are his exposure levels?" Minimal realistically. His attorney is already in contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He'll likely receive immunity in exchange for testimony about Garrett's access pattern at the Millbrook Center. Rachel nodded once. She had told Hayes, he's a deceived man, not a corrupt one. It mattered that she'd been right. Not for her own satisfaction for Walsh, who had given 11 years to a center that genuinely helped people, and who would now have to spend the rest of his life understanding that his trust had been used as a mechanism of theft. The Iron Anchor incident, Park said carefully. Rachel looked at him. It's in Garrett's file. The notation about the altercation, the attempt to connect it to your presence at the center. He paused. Are we concerned that it drew attention to your cover? It did draw attention to my cover, Rachel said. That's why I left the coin. Park blinked. Vasquez leaned forward slightly. You accelerated the timeline deliberately, Vasquez said. It was not entirely a question. Garrett was building the profile on whoever had disrupted his access pattern at Maple Street. He was going to get there eventually, 3 more months, maybe 4. In the meantime, Redgate was conducting the wire transfers on a quarterly schedule, which meant the next window was 8 weeks out. She looked at them both. I needed him to move faster. I needed him to feel the pressure of a potential identification and start making calls that we could record. The bar incident gave me a reason to leave a trail that someone with his background would follow. The coin was bait, Park said. The coin was a filter, she corrected. I needed to know who in that community would recognize it and what they would do with that recognition. The bar gave me the incident. Hayes gave me the confirmation. She paused. He's good, by the way, the corporal. He has good instincts and better judgment, and someone in the Marine Corps should be paying attention to his career trajectory. Vasquez and Park exchanged a look. We'll note that, Vasquez said. Note it formally, Rachel said. He stepped outside his lane to help a federal investigation without any authority requiring him to, and he did it correctly. That deserves something on record. She closed her folder. What else do you need from me? What they needed, it turned out, was another 3 days. Garrett's cooperation came faster than she had predicted. Not 48 hours after his attorney reviewed the government's documentation, he was on record about the full structure of Redgate's operation, naming names, providing internal communications, confirming the shell company architecture that Treasury was using to access the Cayman accounts. He was thorough, methodical. He gave them everything with the systematic precision of a man who had spent his career in intelligence and understood that a complete accounting was worth more in a negotiation than a partial one. Rachel received the summary report in her email Friday morning. She read it at the kitchen table with coffee, working through the 12 pages with a pencil in hand, noting the sections that confirmed what she had built and the sections that added information she had not been able to access from Harbor Point. The full picture was larger than she had known. The operation extended beyond California, beyond the veteran benefit system, touching procurement contracts in 2 other federal departments, through a subsidiary she had identified but not fully traced. She put the pencil down. She looked out the window at the gray Friday morning. She was supposed to be packing. The operation was concluded. Garrett was cooperating. The accounts were frozen. Vasquez and Park had what they needed to build the prosecution. Her role in Harbor Point was finished, and the correct professional move, the move she had made a dozen times before in a dozen different locations, was to close the house, return the keys to the rental agency, and disappear from this small coastal town, the same way she had appeared in it, cleanly, quietly, leaving nothing behind. She was not packing. She was drinking coffee and looking out the window and trying to understand what the feeling was that had been sitting in her chest since she walked out of the Millbrook Veterans Center 2 days ago with Garrett's folder in her hands. It was not mission satisfaction. She knew what that felt like, a clean, calibrated sense of completion, like a mechanism returning to its resting state after a period of high function. She had felt that before. She knew its texture. This was different. Her phone buzzed. Hayes. You still in town? She looked at the message. She typed back. For now. His response came immediately. Mercer wants to talk to you. She stared at that for a long moment. Then she put the phone face down on the table and went back to her coffee. She would have been able to leave without seeing Mercer and some part of her, the part that had spent years learning to exit cleanly, to not accumulate the weight of unresolved human situations in places she was only passing through. That part argued clearly and rationally for exactly that. Pack the car, return the keys, drive south. She called Hayes instead. "Where is he?" she asked. "He's at the Iron Anchor," Hayes said. "He's been there every day this week. Not drinking. Dennis said he's been coming in around noon having lunch leaving. Like he's waiting for something. Like he's waiting for something." She drove to the Iron Anchor at 12:15. The lunch crowd was thin, a handful of civilians, 2 older veterans at a corner table, Dennis behind the bar doing inventory. Mercer was at the far end of the counter, the end away from where he usually sat away from the television and the prime sight lines that his usual spot commanded. He was eating a sandwich and looking at his hands, and he looked, Rachel thought as she walked toward him, like a man who was trying very hard to be smaller than he was. He saw her when she was 6 feet away. He did not stand. He did not make any large gesture. He just looked at her with the careful, slightly wrecked expression of someone who has spent a week doing an honest accounting of themselves and does not love what the numbers came out to. She sat down 2 stools from him. Dennis appeared. She ordered coffee. He poured it and moved to the far end of the bar with the discretion of a man who understood when a conversation needed space. Mercer said, "I didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't," she said honestly. He looked at his sandwich, then at her. "I need to say something, and I need you to let me say it without me losing my nerve halfway through, so I'm going to ask you not to say anything until I'm done." She picked up her coffee. "Okay," she said. He took a breath. "What I did to you at this bar 2.5 weeks ago was wrong," he said. "Not complicated wrong, not context wrong, just wrong. There's no version of what happened where I'm anything other than a man who hit a woman who had asked me repeatedly to leave her alone in front of an audience because she refused to give me the reaction I wanted." He stopped. The muscles in his jaw moved. "I've been in the Marine Corps for 14 years. I've been in combat. I've been in situations where the question of right and wrong was genuinely complicated, where the options were all bad and you had to pick the least bad one." He looked at her. "That night was not complicated. I knew exactly what I was doing. I chose to do it anyway." Rachel said nothing. "I don't know who you are," Mercer said. "I've heard things this week, the kind of things that get said in whispers around a military base when something has happened that nobody can fully explain. I don't know what's true and what isn't, and I'm not asking you to tell me." He paused. "But I know that whoever you are, you were here minding your own business, and I made you into a situation, and you handled it about 1,000 times better than I deserved." The bar was quiet around them. Dennis was at the far end not looking. The veterans at the corner table were in their own conversation. "When you got up off that floor," Rachel said, "the first thing you did was look at your Marines." Mercer flinched slightly. "Yeah. You were checking whether you'd lost them." A beat. "Yeah. And," he was quiet for a moment. "Kowalski told me the next morning that what I did was indefensible. He said it in front of Hayes and 2 other Marines. He said that if I wanted to rebuild any credibility as a leader, I needed to start by understanding that credibility is not something you take from people. It's something you earn from them." He looked at his hands. "Which is not a thing I didn't know. It's a thing I forgot. A thing I let the performance of being confident replace." Rachel drank her coffee. She held the mug with both hands, the same way she had held her water glass 3 weeks ago in this same bar, and she looked at the man across the counter and did what she had learned to do in years of operating in situations where the human elements were as important as the tactical ones. She assessed what was real and what was performance. This was real. The discomfort was genuine. The words were coming from somewhere actual rather than somewhere calculated. "You didn't lose them," she said. He looked up. "Your Marines," she said. The fact that Kowalski said what he said in front of Hayes and two others, that's not abandonment. That's accountability from people who still believe you're capable of better. She paused. Men who are done with a leader don't bother to tell him what he did wrong. They just go quiet. Mercer absorbed that. "I'm not telling you that so you feel better," she said. "I'm telling you that because it's true and because how you respond to it matters more than what happened 3 weeks ago." She set the mug down. "What happened 3 weeks ago is finished. I'm not carrying it, and I don't need you to keep flogging yourself over it. What I need, what your Marines need, what the institution needs, is for you to understand what actually failed and fix it." "The ego," he said. It was not a question. "The belief that authority is the same as strength," she said. "They're not. Authority is assigned, strength is demonstrated. The people who confuse the two consistently need an audience because without the audience, they can't tell the difference themselves." Mercer was quiet for a long moment. "Is that what happened to you?" he asked. "The quiet. The way you are. Is that something you built or something you were born with?" It was a more honest question than she had expected from him. She reconsidered him slightly. "Built," she said. "I was not a quiet person." She picked up the coffee mug again. "I was a very loud person for a very long time, and the loudness served me right up until it got people hurt, and after that I got very quiet very fast." Mercer looked at her with the particular attention of someone who has just been given access to a real piece of a person and is trying to receive it correctly. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what happened to you that made you for whatever that cost you." She looked at him. She had not expected that either. "Thank you," she said. They sat in the quiet of the Iron Anchor for another 10 minutes, drinking their respective things, not filling the silence with anything it didn't need. When Rachel finally stood to leave, Mercer stood as well, not to stop her, just the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised with certain reflexes and was apparently recommitting to them. She picked up her jacket. "Carter," he said. She looked back. "Whatever you're doing here, whatever the thing is that I accidentally walked into 3 weeks ago." He held her eyes. "I hope it went the way it was supposed to go." She looked at him for a long moment. "It went better than that," she said, and she walked out. Hayes was leaning against her car in the parking lot. She had not told him she was coming here, and he had not told her he would be here, and they both pretended for a moment that this was a coincidence. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Is he going to be okay?" She thought about Mercer's face, the genuine discomfort in it, the way the question about how she had built the quiet had come from somewhere real rather than somewhere tactical. "Yes," she said. "He's going to be fine. He's going to be better than fine eventually if he does the work." Hayes nodded. He looked at the harbor, then at her. "You're leaving," he said. She didn't answer immediately. "The operation is done," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He was 24 years old, and he had good instincts and better judgment, and he had spent 3 weeks inside the frame of something that most people his age, most people at any age, never got close to. He had handled all of it with a steadiness that she had not taken for granted. "Yes," she said. "I'm leaving." He nodded once. He had known that was the answer. He had asked anyway because some questions deserve to be asked even when you know what's coming. "The NCIS report," she said. "Vasquez is going to send you something, a formal commendation for your cooperation with a federal investigation. It'll go in your service record." Hayes blinked. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't." She met his eyes. "You did something that required real judgment and real courage, and you did it without any obligation and without asking what was in it for you. That goes on record. That's not negotiable." He looked at the ground, then back up. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "The thing you said to Mercer, about being loud for a long time and then getting quiet after someone got hurt." He held her gaze carefully. "Who got hurt?" The question sat between them in the morning air. She considered it. Not whether to answer, she was not going to answer, that was clear, but what to say instead of answering, because he had earned something for asking correctly. The mission that ended my operational career, she said finally, involved a decision I made under time pressure with incomplete information. The decision was tactically sound by every standard I had been trained to apply. The outcome— She stopped, started again. The outcome was not something the training prepared me for. Hayes said nothing. 3 people came home because of the decision, she said. 1 person didn't. And the 1 person who didn't was the one who had trusted me most completely, which meant that the weight of it, the specific quality of that weight, has no clean resolution. She looked at him steadily. That's why I got quiet. Not because quiet is better, because loud after that felt like a form of disrespect to her. Hayes held very still. Her, he said softly. Her. Rachel confirmed. The word hung in the air between them, simple and heavy and complete. And Hayes did not push further, because he understood that this was the most she would give, and more than he had a right to expect. And it was enough. It was more than enough. She'd be proud of what you did this week, he said. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face moved. Not tears, something quieter than tears and more permanent. I know, she said. That's the part I'm still learning to live with. She unlocked the car. She put the jacket on the passenger seat. She stood for one more moment with her hand on the roof of the car, looking at the harbor, at the particular gray-blue of the water in the flat November light. 3 weeks ago she had walked into the iron anchor intending to be invisible and had ended up being the most visible person in the room. She had handled it. She had turned it. She had used the exposure that Mercer had forced on her as the mechanism for accelerating an operation that might otherwise have taken months more. She was very good at this. She had always been very good at this. The question she had been unable to answer since Wednesday morning. The question that had kept her from packing, from returning the keys, from doing the thing she had done a dozen times in a dozen cities, was whether being very good at this was the same thing as being where she was supposed to be. She had not answered it yet. She got in the car. She drove back to the house on the water, and she did not pack, and she did not call Vasquez to arrange her formal debrief exit, and she did not do the dozen small administrative things that closing an operation required. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and she thought about a woman named Sarah Okafor, who had trusted her completely and not come home, and she thought about 6 weeks of early morning runs and bad coffee and filing paperwork at a veterans center that needed people, and about a 24-year-old Marine corporal who had picked a coin up off a bar floor out of instinct and done everything right with it. And she thought about what it meant that for the first time in 3 years, she had somewhere she wanted to be in the morning that wasn't somewhere she'd been assigned to be. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Vasquez. She let it ring 3 times. Then she answered it. I need 1 more week, she said. A pause on the other end. Rachel. 1 week, she said. There are loose ends in the Redgate subsidiary structure that the Virginia team hasn't fully traced. I'm closer to that paper trail than they are. Give me 1 week and I will hand them the Cayman connection on a plate. Another pause, longer. 1 week, Vasquez said. She exhaled. Thank you. She put the phone down. She looked at the kitchen, the coffee mug in the drying rack, the morning light coming through the window. The ordinary domestic architecture of a life she had constructed as a cover, and which had somewhere in the last 6 weeks started to feel like something else. 1 week. She was not ready to name what was happening. She was not sure naming it would help. But she was a person who had learned to trust her own instincts at the most fundamental level in situations where instinct was the only instrument that worked, and every instinct she had was telling her the same thing. She was not done here. Not with the case, not with Harbor Point, not with the version of herself that had been slowly, quietly, without her fully noticing, assembling itself in the space between who she used to be and who she was still becoming. The 1 week became 10 days. Rachel did not apologize for that when she filed the extension request with Vasquez, and Vasquez did not push back, because the Cayman connection she had promised him materialized on day 6 in a form that was cleaner and more complete than anything the Virginia team had been able to assemble in 3 months of parallel work. 3 shell companies, 2 beneficial ownership structures hidden behind nominee directors, and 1 wire routing pattern that tied directly to the personal accounts of Redgate's chief operating officer, a man named Alan Pressler, who had spent 17 years building a reputation as a defense industry reformer and whose name appeared on 2 government advisory panels and a congressional testimony about veteran services. When Park forwarded her the summary of Pressler's reaction to being served at his home in Arlington at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning, Rachel read it once, set her phone down, and went for her run. 6 miles. Hard. Up Harborview Drive and back. She did not feel triumphant. She had stopped expecting to feel triumphant somewhere around year 4 of doing this kind of work, when she understood that the takedown was never the end of the story. It was just the moment where the story became someone else's job. Prosecutors and defense attorneys and judges and juries would spend the next 2 years deciding what Pressler's choices were worth in the currency of consequence. She would not be in the room for any of it. She was never in the room for any of it. That had always been the architecture of her work build. The case handed off, disappear. She had believed for a long time that this was the correct design. That the disappearing was as important as the building, that her effectiveness depended on her invisibility. That the moment she became a fixture in any place was the moment her utility in that place ended. She was at the top of Harborview Drive, lungs burning, looking out at the harbor below, when her phone buzzed. Hayes Garrett testified this morning. It's done. She stopped running. She stood at the top of the hill and looked at the water and did not move for a long time. Done. She had heard that word applied to operations before, and it had always meant the same thing: pack close, leave. The word was a door, and the door only opened in one direction. She had walked through it more times than she could easily count, in more cities than she had allowed herself to become attached to, and she had always walked through it cleanly, because she had always understood that clean exits were a form of professionalism. She walked back down the hill. She did not pack. Yo. Garrett's testimony lasted 4 hours and covered the full 11 years of Redgate's fraudulent operation with the systematic, detailed precision of a man who had decided that comprehensive cooperation was the only intelligent strategy available to him. His attorney had negotiated the terms, carefully reduced charges, sentencing consideration, the specific language around his Gulf War service and his early contractor work that predated the fraud, and Garrett had delivered exactly what he had promised to deliver. Rachel received the transcript summary from Vasquez that afternoon and read it at the kitchen table with the same pencil she had used on the evidentiary report, making small marks in the margins. Not because she needed to annotate anything for professional purposes, but because the act of marking a document while reading it was a habit from her operational years that she had never shed and had stopped trying to. 3 things in the transcript stopped her. The first was Garrett's description of how the operation had selected its targets, the specific veterans whose benefit files had been redirected. The selection was not random. Redgate had built a profiling algorithm that identified cases where the probability of detection was lowest: veterans who were deceased with no surviving family members making active claims, veterans with severe cognitive impairments who could not advocate for themselves, veterans who had been homeless or transient and had lost contact with the system entirely. They had targeted the most vulnerable, the most invisible. Rachel set the pencil down for a moment. She picked it up again. The second thing that stopped her was a section of Garrett's testimony about the veteran centers, specifically the network of resource organizations he had spent months mapping, assessing their protocols, identifying which ones had notification systems and which ones were operating on trust and relationship rather than formal accountability structures. He described the Maple Street Center in Harbor Point. He described the coordinator there, Dennis Walsh, at Millbrook. He described 8 other centers across California, Oregon, and Washington. And then he said something that Rachel had to read 3 times. He said that the reason the Maple Street Center had become a focus of his concern was not the notification protocol itself, but the volunteer who had implemented it. He said that when he visited the center in October and again in November. He had recognized something in the way she moved and watched and positioned herself in a room that triggered a specific professional alarm. He said he had spent 4 weeks building a profile before he could name what he was recognizing. He said he had finally named it. She moved like someone who had been trained to survive in environments where being identified meant not coming home. The federal prosecutor had asked him, "And when you identified that, what did you do?" Garrett had said, "I made calls. I tried to find out who she was and what agency she was connected to. And while I was doing that, she was building a record of everything I did, and she moved faster than I did. And that is why we are sitting here today." Rachel read that section a 4th time, then she closed the transcript. She sat in the kitchen of the rented house and felt the weight of those words settle in the specific way that true things settle. Not lightly, not with the temporary satisfaction of a compliment, but with the permanent, slightly uncomfortable density of something that has been confirmed about yourself that you had not entirely admitted was true. She moved like someone trained to survive in environments where being identified meant not coming home. That was not wrong. The question she had been sitting with since Wednesday, since the parking lot outside the Iron Anchor, since Hayes had looked at her and said she was not done here, with a certainty that she had not been prepared for the question, was whether that was all she was. Whether the training and the invisibility and the clean exits were the whole of it, or whether there was something underneath them that had its own needs and its own direction, and had been waiting with considerable patience for her to stop moving long enough to ask what it wanted. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Not Vasquez, not Park, not Hayes. A number she recognized but had not seen in 14 months. She picked up. "Commander Chen," she said. "Rachel." The voice on the other end was crisp and warm in equal measure, a combination Rachel associated entirely with Diana Chen, who had been her commanding officer for 4 years, and her friend for considerably longer, and who had left both roles simultaneously when Rachel left the program, and had respected the distance Rachel needed without ever pretending the distance wasn't painful. "I heard this morning that the Redgate operation closed." "News travels. In certain channels, yes." A pause. "Are you in Harbor Point? For now?" "For now," Chen repeated, and Rachel could hear the careful attention in it. Diana Chen had always been able to hear the things people embedded in their word choices. How long has "for now" been the answer? Rachel looked at the pencil on the table. 10 days, she said. 10 days past the original close date. There were loose ends. "The loose ends have been tied," Chen said. "Vasquez told me when he called this morning. The Cayman connection, the Pressler arrest, the testimony. Rachel, you handed them a complete package. There are no loose ends." Rachel said nothing. "So, for now is not about the operation," Chen said. Still nothing. "Rachel!" Chen's voice shifted slightly, not harder, but more direct. The voice she used when she had decided that kindness and directness were the same thing, and there was no point in choosing between them. "Tell me what's happening." Rachel exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to do this anymore," she said. Silence on the other end. Not the silence of surprise. Diana Chen was not surprised by this, Rachel could tell, but the silence of someone giving a true statement, the room it needed. "Do what?" Chen asked. "Leave." Rachel looked at the window. "Pack and close and leave and go somewhere else and do it again. I've done it. I've done it a dozen times, and I knew how to do it, because I understood why it was necessary, and understanding why something is necessary makes it possible to do it regardless of how it feels." She stopped. "I don't understand why it's necessary anymore." "Because the work requires it," Chen said. "The work requires me to be invisible," Rachel said. "It doesn't require me to be stateless." The distinction landed in the silence between them. "No," Chen said quietly. "It doesn't. Diana." Rachel pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. "I haven't wanted to stay somewhere in 3 years. I haven't. I've been careful not to want it. I've moved before the wanting could start. And I don't know if what I'm feeling right now is legitimate, or if it's just fatigue. Accumulated fatigue wearing the costume of something real." How do you feel when you imagine leaving tomorrow? Chen asked. Rachel did not answer immediately. She let herself actually feel it, not assess it, not analyze the strategic implications of it, but feel it the way you feel a temperature change or the shift in pressure before weather. Like I'm abandoning something, she said. The operation is closed. Not the operation. A long silence. The center, Chen said. The center. And Rachel stopped. And maybe something else, something that doesn't have a professional category. Does it need one? Rachel was quiet. Rachel, Chen said, you have spent 3 years telling yourself that Sarah's death was a debt you owed the work, that staying in motion was the payment, that stopping somewhere, building something, wanting something ordinary, that was a thing you didn't get to have because of what happened on that mission. A pause. And I've watched you pay that debt for 3 years, and I have never said this to you because I didn't think you were ready to hear it. But you are ready now, so I'm going to say it. Another pause. Sarah would think you were being an idiot. The laugh that came out of Rachel was entirely involuntary. Short, sharp, real. She would, Rachel said. She would use exactly that word, Chen said. She would say, Carter, you are being a complete and utter idiot, and I am dead, and therefore I have authority on this subject, so listen to me. Rachel pressed her hand to her mouth. I miss her, Rachel said. The words came out simpler than she had expected. No weight around them, just the plain, clean fact. I know you do, Chen said. I miss her too. I'm going to miss her for the rest of my life. A beat. And she is still not a reason for you to refuse to live yours. She called Hayes at 4 in the afternoon. Are you at the center? She asked. I can be, he said. Give me 20 minutes. She was already in her car. She found him in the parking lot of the Maple Street Center, leaning against his truck with his hands in his pockets and the particular careful expression he wore when he knew something was coming and wasn't sure what shape it would take. She had learned to recognize that expression over 3 weeks. She had learned without intending to a great deal about Marcus Hayes over 3 weeks. She got out of the car and stood in the afternoon cold and looked at him. I need to ask you something, she said. Okay. The center. She chose her words precisely. The coordinator position, the full-time coordinator position that Walsh's departure is going to leave open. Hayes went very still. I know it's not mine to claim, she said. I know there's a process. Board approval, background review, the whole administrative structure. She paused. But I need to know if it's a real position or if it was held together by one man's dedication for 11 years and will dissolve without him. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. You're asking if it's worth staying for, he said. She did not look away. Yes, she said. He exhaled. Slow and controlled, like someone managing a larger feeling than the moment technically called for. The board has 2 members who've been trying to professionalize the coordinator role for 3 years. Give it real staffing, a real budget, formal protocols. Walsh resisted because he thought institutionalizing it would make it cold. Hayes paused. He wasn't entirely wrong about that risk, but without the professionalization, it was also vulnerable to exactly what happened. And the board. They're meeting Thursday. He looked at her with the clear, direct attention she had come to understand was his default mode when he was being completely honest. Rachel, if you walked into that meeting and said you wanted the position, they would give it to you before you finished the sentence. She absorbed that. It's not field work, he said carefully, not cautioning her, just making sure the thing he said next had the right context. It's phones and filing and benefit paperwork and sitting across from people who are struggling and trying to connect them to what they need. It's ordinary. I know what it is, she said. I've been doing it for 10 weeks. He was quiet. Hayes, she said. Is it worth doing? He looked at her with an expression that carried a weight she had not seen in his face before. Not the young Marine steadiness she had come to rely on, but something older, Something that came from whatever it was that had made him start volunteering at a veterans center in the first place, the thing he had never explained, and she had never asked about. "My father did 22 years, he said. When he came out, he spent 6 months trying to navigate the benefit system by himself. He didn't know what he qualified for. He didn't know who to call. He spent $200 he didn't have on a benefits consultant who turned out to know less than he did." He paused. He ended up at a center like this one. A volunteer there, a retired Navy corpsman, who did this work because he genuinely wanted to spend 3 hours with my dad one afternoon and got him connected to everything he was owed. Hayes met her eyes. "My dad still talks about that afternoon. 14 years later, he still talks about it." Rachel held his gaze. "Yeah," Hayes said quietly, "it's worth doing." She walked into the Iron Anchor at 6:15. She had not planned this. She had driven past it on the way back from the Maple Street Center and pulled into the lot without fully deciding to, and now she was inside, and Dennis Greer was behind the bar, looking at her with the expression of a man who was very good at not showing surprise. "Water," he said. "Please," she said. And then, actually, she paused. "What do you have on tap?" Dennis looked at her for one full second. Then a slow smile crossed his face, small, private, genuine. He named 3 beers. She picked one. He poured it and set it in front of her and said nothing, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate most about Dennis Greer. She was halfway through the beer when the door opened and Mercer came in. He saw her immediately. He stopped for a half second. Then he walked to the bar and sat 3 stools down, not 2, not directly beside her 3, which was the distance of a man who was trying to respect a boundary while also not fleeing from a situation he needed to learn to inhabit. "Carter," he said. "Mercer," she said. Dennis poured him a bourbon without being asked. Old habit. They sat in silence for a moment. "Heard there were arrests in San Diego this week," Mercer said. "Federal level, something connected to veteran benefits fraud." "That's public," she said. "It is." He turned his glass slowly. "Also heard the investigation had been running here in Harbor Point for 6 weeks. She took a sip of her beer. "Rumors," she said. "Sure," he said. "Lot of those going around." He paused. "Kowalski told me that the challenge coin Hayes picked up, the one with the trident Kowalski, said a guy he trained with in 2019 recognized that particular design. Said it belonged to a NCIS Special Operations Consulting program that officially doesn't exist." Rachel looked at her beer. "Kowalski talks a lot," she said. "Kowalski is careful about what he says and to who. If he talked, it was because he decided I was ready to hear it." Mercer set his glass down. "I'm not asking you to confirm anything. I'm not asking for details. I just—" He stopped, collected himself. "I want to understand what I walked into, not because I think I deserve to understand it, just because understanding things is how I stop making the same mistakes." Rachel turned and looked at him. He was not the same man who had walked across this bar 3 weeks ago with his chest forward and his Marines watching, and the complete conviction of someone who had never been seriously challenged by any room he entered. The frame was the same. The width of him, the combat ribbon's history of him, but something inside it had been rearranged. Not reduced, rearranged, like furniture moved to let more light in. "You walked into an operation," she said. "Active. 6 weeks in. I was here specifically to be overlooked, and you made it difficult to overlook me. And I handled the situation the way I was trained to handle situations." She paused. "That's all I'm going to say about it." "That's more than I expected," he said honestly. "You asked honestly. I answered accordingly." He nodded. "The way you moved," he said. "That night, when I—" He stopped. Tried a different approach. "I've been in combatives training for 14 years. I have my MCMAP instructor certification. I thought I understood what the upper limit of close quarters response looked like." "You had a partial picture," she said. "Yeah." He looked at his hands. "I've been thinking about that." about how much of what I knew I had mistaken for all of what was true. He looked up. It's a disorienting thing, to realize your ceiling was someone else's floor. She was quiet for a moment. It doesn't have to be disorienting, she said. It can be motivating. The difference being, whether you're looking at it from above or from below. She turned back to her beer. From above, the gap between where you were and where the ceiling actually is looks like failure. From below, it looks like distance you could cover. Mercer was quiet for a long moment. How do you flip the angle? He said. She thought about Diana Chen's voice on the phone that afternoon. About Sarah Okafor, who had trusted her completely and not come home. About the 3 years she had spent in motion, because motion felt like penance, and penance felt like the only honest response she had available. About the moment at the top of Harbor View Drive, when she had stopped running and looked at the harbor below and understood finally that penance and purpose were not the same thing, and that she had been confusing them for so long that the confusion had started to feel like identity. You stop performing the gap, she said. You stop announcing it either to prove it doesn't exist or to apologize for the fact that it does. You go back to work, differently, with the knowledge that there's more ceiling than you thought. She paused. That's it. That's the whole method. Mercer absorbed that. He finished his bourbon. Are you staying? He asked. In Harbor Point. The question was direct and clean, and contained no subtext other than the literal one he wanted to know, because he was a man trying to relearn how to occupy a community, honestly, and whether she was part of that community was relevant information. Yes, she said. The word came out without hesitation, without qualification, without the 10-day accumulation of deliberation that had preceded it. Just yes. Mercer nodded once. He flagged Dennis for another round for both of them, she noticed, and she let it happen. He was not performing generosity. He was practicing it quietly in the small, specific way that people practice things they have decided to take seriously. Dennis refilled her beer without comment. She let him. The board meeting was Thursday at 10. Rachel arrived 9 minutes early. She sat across from 4 people, 2 retired military, 1 civilian administrator, 1 veteran advocacy attorney, and she told them who she was, in the way she had been learning to tell people who she was, accurately, completely, without the performance of humility that concealed pride and without the performance of confidence that concealed nothing. She told them she had a background in special operations and federal law enforcement consulting. She told them she had spent the last 6 weeks at the Maple Street Center because her work had brought her to Harbor Point and the center had needed volunteers. She told them she had identified vulnerabilities in the center's operational structure and implemented protocols to address them. She told them that the federal investigation into veteran benefits fraud that had concluded the previous week was connected to those vulnerabilities and to her work. And she told them she could not provide specific details, but could provide documentation of her professional background and federal references on request. She told them she wanted to stay. That was the last thing she said. Simple declarative without architecture around it. She wanted to stay. She wanted the coordinator position, and she believed she could do the work well for reasons that were professional and also personal. And she was not going to pretend the personal component didn't exist, because it did, and it mattered. The board chair, a retired Navy captain named Flores 68, who had the particular quality of stillness that Rachel recognized in people who had spent decades in rooms where the stakes were real, looked at her for a long moment after she finished. The federal references, he said. Would one of them be NCIS? Yes, she said. Flores looked at the other 3 board members. Something passed between them that was not quite a conversation and not quite a vote, but contained elements of both. Ms. Carter, Flores said, can you start Monday, Bochamag? She called Chen that evening. I took a job, she said. A pause. Tell me, Chen said. She told her. The Veterans Center. The coordinator position. Harbor Point. The board meeting and Flores and the start date of Monday, and the particular quality of the afternoon light on the harbor that she had been looking at from the kitchen window for 10 weeks, and that she had finally admitted to herself not willing to stop looking at. Chen was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Rachel," she said. "I know. This is permanent. I know. Or as permanent as you decide to make it. Which is the point, isn't it? That it's your decision." "Yes," Rachel said. "That's the point." Another pause. Longer. The kind of pause that Chen used when she was feeling something she had decided to let herself feel rather than manage. "She would be so relieved," Chen said. Her voice was slightly different from its usual register, thinner, warmer. "Sarah, she spent the last 6 months of the program worrying about you. Whether the work was the only thing holding you together." Rachel looked at the window. "It was," she said, "for a while. And now." She thought about that. She thought about Hayes picking up a challenge coin off a bar floor because it was the right thing to do. She thought about Mercer in a parking lot learning to ask for help. She thought about Walsh deceived and not corrupt carrying the weight of 11 years of genuine service alongside the weight of having been used. She thought about the veterans whose files had been redirected. Men and women who had given what could not be given back and who had been failed by a system that was supposed to hold the debt honestly. She thought about the ordinary work of phones and filing and sitting across from people who were struggling and trying to connect them to what they needed. "Now, I have other things," she said. She told Hayes on Friday. They were at the center. She had come in voluntarily, which was something she had done every day for 10 weeks, but today it felt different, because on Monday it would be her name on the coordinator schedule, and her responsibility to make sure the phones were answered and the protocols were maintained, and the people who walked through the door were met by someone who understood both the administrative structure of what they were owed and the human reality of what it cost to come in and ask for it. Hayes was filing intake forms at the cabinet when she came in. He looked up. She told him she had taken the job. He looked at her for a moment. Then he put the folder down and crossed the room and put his arms around her briefly, and without drama, the way a person hugs someone when they are relieved in a way that has no better expression available. And she let him, because she had been learning slowly, and with the particular difficulty of someone for whom allowing things was harder than doing them. She was learning that letting people respond to her with genuine feeling was not the same as vulnerability. That it was, in fact, the opposite of the kind of vulnerability she feared. That it was what strength looked like when it had stopped needing to announce itself. He stepped back. He was smiling. "Your desk is the one by the window," he said. "The coordinator always gets the one by the window." She looked at the desk. The window faced east. In the mornings when she came in early, which she would because she was always early in the mornings, the light would come through that window and fall across the surface of the desk, and she would sit there and do the work, the ordinary and necessary and genuinely important work of helping people who had served their country access what they were owed, and she would do it without a cover identity, and without an exit strategy, and without the particular loneliness of invisibility that she had worn for so long that she had almost stopped recognizing it as a cost. She sat down at the desk. She put her hands flat on the surface. The wood was warm from the morning light. She thought about the night at the Iron Anchor 3 weeks and what felt like a different life ago. The woman at the end of the bar who had wanted only to be left alone, who had been forced into visibility by a man who mistook quiet for weakness, who had handled what came after with the training and precision of someone who had survived things the room could not imagine. She thought about how that night had been the accidental beginning of something she had not been looking for and had not known she needed, and would not have found if Ryan Mercer had simply listened when she asked him to walk away. She thought about the complexity of that, the way the worst thing that had happened to her in Harbor Point had also indirectly, and without anyone intending it, become the reason she was sitting at this desk in this light on this Friday morning, with something that felt cautiously and genuinely like the beginning of a life she had chosen rather than a role she was playing. She thought about how nothing real ever arrived cleanly, how the things worth having almost always came wrapped in the things you would not have chosen. Hayes sat down at his own desk across the room and picked up the phone and answered a call with the easy professionalism of someone who had been doing this for 8 months and knew what the person on the other end needed before they finished their first sentence. Rachel opened the intake log. She began to read. Outside the window, Harbor Point went on in its ordinary way. The harbor, the coast road, the base down the water, the bar on the corner where Dennis Greer was already setting up for the day, the barracks where young Marines were learning the difference between authority and strength, in the slow, difficult, necessary way that lessons of that quality always have to be learned. The whole ordinary architecture of a place that was, as of this morning, hers. Not a cover, not a posting, not a 6-week assignment with a clean exit built into the design. Hers. Rachel Carter, who had been trained to survive in environments where being identified meant not coming home, had finally been identified, not by an enemy, not by a threat, not by a man who should have walked away when she asked him to, but by herself in the quiet accumulation of 10 weeks of ordinary mornings and genuine work, and the slow, patient insistence of a life that had been waiting for her to stop running long enough to recognize it. She had survived everything the world had sent at her. Now, for the first time in 3 years, she was ready to do something harder than survive. She was ready to stay.